Greetings, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining me. As always, I want to thank you for coming into this space. Those of you who are traditional or longtime supporters, and those of you who are here for the very first time, I welcome you both the same. In this session, I want to get into authenticity, and the segment or the insight is entitled "Your Own Kind of Way." And we're looking at the power of authenticity. And, this is an important sort of concept and thought because living in the Western Hemisphere, uh, we don't necessarily get praise for authenticity unless it's authenticity mixed with toxicity, and even that oftentimes is not one's authentic voice. Some people think it's just very normal and natural to be toxic without realizing that that is a sign of a deeper and more sinister and destructive infiltration of their own spirit. So, yeah, if we can see authenticity as a call, um, we understand that a call is like a voicing. Many things begin with a voicing. And the first thing I want you to sort of wrap around your dome, if possible, is that you came into this world with a purpose and a vibration that is uniquely your own. And you're not here to fit into anyone's mold or a mold that was created by someone else, but rather you are here to express what we would consider your divine essence, uh, and that essence that lives within you. And I know that may seem very generic, but I think it's a very important statement because, again, living in the West, that thought and that way of seeing the world, living in the world, is dismantled in 101 different ways. We live in a world that conditions us to be everything except who and what we actually are, who we truly are, which is probably a better even term. From birth, we are assigned identities, we're assigned expectations, and many of us are assigned a path. And those paths and those expectations and those identities usually have very little to do with the rhythm of our own soul. Our souls move in a certain timing when things happen or when things are revealed. And there's a clock, there's a rhythm, and there's a clock that's often ignored because of the society that we come up in that wants to use us for something else. The great challenge in life is to return to the essence of what we were before the world told us who we should be. And there are sages and mystics and gurus and teachers who have been teaching for millions of years, how to return to the source of what we actually are. That's the great moment of celebration. In the Torah, we find the story of Musa or Moses, or Orumila or Tahuti or Moshe, um, or Dr. John Henrik Clark. And in this story, we understand that Musa or Moses is a man who was raised in Pharaoh's palace. And even though he was raised in the palace of Pharaoh, he was called to lead his own people. So when the call comes, he's reluctant, he's uncertain, and he's burdened by self-doubt. And he asks, who am I to speak? Of many of us, we know like Moses had a stuttering problem. So he asked the creator, like, who am I to even say anything? And part of the creator's response when he's sharing, part of his response is, Eye asher eye, meaning I am what I am creating. Now when that's translated into your English versions, you're given I am that I am. It doesn't give us much information as maybe we like. But I am that which I am becoming, or I am that which I am creating, is the ultimate affirmation of authenticity, that we are to reflect. I am what I am becoming, period. you know, so the divine in that moment doesn't command Musa to become something else than other than what he is. The divine, in his speech and in his reflection says, be what you already are. That's enough. That is actually your superpower. Your superpower is just being who and what you are, not striving for what some model or some mold or some idea of what the world is giving you and told you is greatness. And many of us, we wear this mask where we pretend to have that greatness, or we wear a mask of inauthenticity because we feel we need to do so every day. Many of us, we wear these masks on a daily basis. And there's a war that exists between our mask and our soul. And the thing is, some of the masks we wear, like we're sons, we're daughters, we're leaders, we're professionals, we're students, we're parents, we're friends, right? YouTubers, whatever herbers there are. But those roles are not who or what we are. Those roles are constructs, so they're just masks. They're masks that have been constructed. I think about some of my time in what's considered the southern part of Akibalan. It's not really the south though, but and when I was doing my Sangoma studies, there was a lot of wisdom that was imparted to me at that time that I needed at that stage in my life. And one of the things I remember very distinctly was that we were taught that illness begins inside of the soul, and more specifically, illness begins when the soul is disconnected from its original path. That's when one starts to experience some sort of illness. And that was called soul sickness. As I was taught, that was the working definition of soul sickness. And soul sickness was when we were in a place where we were betraying our authenticity in order to fit into systems that don't nourish the spirit, and it's a betrayal of ourselves in that sense. So, sometimes you will be working with someone on a spiritual level, and, you'll be told, okay, this person is sick, but, or you have to tell somebody you're sick, but the healing is not in the medicine alone, but the healing is in your willingness to realign, to return to the truth of your own nature, and that's very hard for many people. They've learned to become devil, especially original people. They've learned to become other than themselves by the foods that they eat, the culture that they take on, what they choose to shelter themselves inside of, the rhythms that they dance to, the colors that they wear. I mean, we could go on and on and on, that they have betrayed their true nature and now have created a soul sickness. I remember Dr. Asa Hilliard. He said, you can't begin to heal until you reclaim the vibration of your ancestors. And I always thought that was like a key statement, because in that he's saying, like, it's not just that your ancestors. Like some of us, we have images, or maybe old video footage or photographs and things like that, and or we know our lineage, like we have family trees and things like that. But it's not just about knowing your lineage. It means that um, tapping into the cosmic blueprint of your DNA, or of your own existence. The DNA of your soul's purpose is actually what's more important than even just knowing your lineage. For those who say, well, I don't know my ancestors, I don't know, where I'm from, or this or that, when you begin to break away from the illusion that tells you who you must be, And you start to, as opposed to that, you instead, you embrace the divine contract that you made before you were born. That rhythm and that blueprint of your egun, or of your ancestors, will start to become more apparent, and it'll start to play itself out in your own reality a lot more, than some of us have experienced in our life. There's a reality to authenticity that's not just about a concept, a psychological concept, or just saying, well, I'm living by like I've shared before, the word ma'at means authentic. It's not just, I'm living by the laws of ma'at, I'm authentic. It's an energetic reality. It's an energetic reality. So it's energy, and when you're looking at things from a metaphysical perspective, in metaphysics, we have an understanding that energy follows intention. There's been whole books and like movie series. Even I guess a lot of the like Christian preachers have they were for a long time, it was a name it and claim it movement, or the abundance movement, where it was all, I'm going to think this and I'm going to get this. Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich. Dale Carnegie, who was of course a forerunner of Napoleon Hill. But it was all the same sort of concept of, where I put my thoughts and my intention is where my energy will flow. If you could imagine, for those who maybe have a little trouble with that, imagine a river. And when you have a river, it when it flows freely, it carves out the land. It carves valleys. In fact, it nourishes the land. It feeds the land. It moves with a sort of grace. A sort of effortless grace, if you will. But when it's dammed up, when it's clogged up, when it's blocked, uh, when it's redirected against its natural flow or its natural course, it stagnates. It creates an imbalance, and it creates an imbalance within itself and everything around it. And your chi, or your ashe, or your ruach, or your life force, it operates the same exact way. The same exact way. When you force yourself into a role that doesn't align with your nature, what you're doing is you're becoming energy blocked. And once you become energy blocked, now you start to experience anxiety. Now you start to experience fear. Now you start to experience stress. And all of these things are symptoms of a spiritual resistance. And what's being resisted? Well, you are resisting you, the real you. So the mask and the soul are now at war. You see, and as a result, it creates this blockage and this redirection and this sort of unnatural positioning. Um, when we also look at the Torah, we learn about this divine spark, or the spark of divine. It's called the neshama, and that's a spark that it's not here to be hidden, and it's not here to be reshaped by external forces. You know, it's just here to shine. Just as a flame, a flame never asks you permission if it can burn, and you can't really do much to reshape a flame. It's a flame. It does what it does. So there's a sort of breaking free that we tap into when we tap into the neshama. We tap into this sort of energy of like, I'm here. I don't want to use someone else's slogan, but there's a slogan that starts with I'm here, but I'm here to sort of flower and to sort of radiate and to glow, and however I oxidate and burst up, whatever shape it is, that's my natural form. When we embark on the path of the initiate, the one who is initiating into deeper knowledge, deeper wisdom, deeper truth, one of the things that we need on our hero's journey is courage. because authenticity, it requires courage, right? In every wisdom tradition that I've come across, and I'm sure that you will, there is a path of the initiative, of the initiate. There's a path, and there's one who leaves the world that's familiar to them, and they step into their true self, you know, and it's sort of a process that one undergoes. It's not always pleasant. And there's different ways that the initiate begins that process. Like in the Sangoma system, um, we undergo initiation to learn a new thing, well, not just to learn a new thing, rather, but to remember what we forgot. So it's not just about adding on, it's about returning to the source. We go into a space where we're now guided to listen to our ancestors. We listen to the whispers of the unseen. We walk according to our spiritual DNA. And listening to ancestors and listening to whispers doesn't mean that you're necessarily guided by higher and better forces, but you want to hear what the heck is going on around you. You want to see what's going on around you, and then you want to do a comparison between those things and the messages from your soul. In the Kabbalah or in Kabbalistic systems, we have this concept of the teshuvah, and the teshuvah is the return. It's the going to the origin, but you're not returning to something external. Like sometimes I think I spoke recently about the Back to Africa movement with Garvey in the 1920s, or maybe that was just a song. I feel like I spoke about it in an insight, but nonetheless, it's a return to the essence of the soul, teshuva. So to become whole, the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that we've strayed, and that's difficult because you live in a world that will just point at you and say, tell yourself you're great. Tell yourself you're perfect. You're beautiful. You're right where you're supposed to be. That's not genuine. There's something simple that you could do that might scare the mess out of you. Sit in stillness. Try it. Just try to sit in stillness and ask yourself, you know, what have I abandoned in myself to gain the approval from others? Breathe deeply as you do it. And you're going to notice if you ask that question and you ask it sincerely, you're going to start to feel the weight of false identities on you. You'll feel them there's something you carry. And I would urge you to release those false identities, and as you release them, see them just dissolve in light, like a bill would dissolve in your fireplace, just see them dissolve. And, that's a moment for you to sort of realize that you don't need permission to be yourself, but if you can just sit in stillness for a moment and allow that process and see where the divine takes you, because the divine higher originator and creator has already given you the authority to be yourself. So why would I need to ask someone or something external to be what I have already been sanctioned to be? I've already been sanctioned to be Johnny Blaze, if you will, to kind of blaze up and be what I was authentically and artfully designed to be. So there are different tools that we can use to help us to sort of live more authentically, if you will. And I'll share just a few. I have shared them before, but I've been doing this for a while, so I know sometimes some of the information is there's a lot to sort of uncover, which is what I want. That's a part of when I'm no longer here. You got a lifetime of information, and those who come after you and after me can start from the beginning and get a lifetime of information to study. It's like if you ever look at the speeches of Minister Farrakhan, it's like you could just be watching these all day. Like there's so many, dating back. You start to realize how long he's been. Elijah Muhammad died in 1975, so you start to think about, like, man, how long Minister Farrakhan has been speaking. So one of the things I was sharing, right, just to not divert too much, but authenticity is not just a psychological and emotional state, it's an energetic reality. So for every aspect of our being, there's a frequency, right? And when we're aligning with that frequency, we start to uh, move harmoniously with the cosmic order, because the frequency that's inside of you was implanted by the cosmic order, right? So when we begin to live according to external expectations, I'm this old, this should be happening. I'm a man, this should be happening. I'm a woman, this should be happening. I'm this race, this should be happening. I'm from this country, I'm from this neighborhood. When we start to do that, we create a dissonance within ourselves. And that dissonance eventually leads to spiritual and then physical distress. You see, that's what happens. So, like I said, there's a couple things you can do to sort of make a part of your practice to help you realign. Again, all things require courage. And like I just said, even the practice of sitting still and asking, like, what have I abandoned? Like, what have I given up to please others? You might not even, I know some who won't do that because they won't even want to hear the answer. So even that takes courage. But when you start to clear these blockages and strengthen your inner connection, you'll find that realigning becomes like more of a lifestyle as opposed to like, okay, deep breath, here we go. So I would say, just to get to it, one of the first things you can utilize is sound frequency, because, man, the power of your voice is amazing. Some of you just don't know it. Voicing is amazing. Think about John 1:1. In the beginning was the word. And I could do a breakdown on that another time, man, but that alone, in the beginning was the word. The word was with God. The word was God. So yeah, we'll do it. We'll do a whole nother segment of John 1:1 or Jan 1:1 or Eon 1:1. But in many esoteric systems, man, around the world, it's the spoken word that's recognized as a bridge between the unseen world and the seen world, or the unseen world and the manifested world. Even when you think about ancient Israelites, uh, those who were, following the law, ancient Israelites, they believed in the creative power of sound. They advocated that. And so they made sure that their words and their language and their names held sacred vibration. They didn't name something or name themselves based off of the name sounded cool or it was sexy, or sometimes people hear a name and like, man, I always liked that name. Why? But they moved towards sacred vibration. In Kabbalistic teachings, divine names are considered to be so powerful that just speaking certain names can transform reality. You know, uh, and I can speak for many Akibalonic systems. I mean, and Kabbalistic system is Akibalonic. For any of you who are confused, Akibalonic African, right? But in Akibalonic spiritual systems, we have drumming, we have chanting, right? And during our drumming and our chanting, we have names that are invoked and that are used to awaken the soul's power. I grew up doing that, drumming and chanting, you know, uh, names, words I didn't even understand, singing to Ogun, singing to Shango, singing to, at that time, Yemenya, before I learned proper wording, Obatala, invoking certain realities within my own chakra system, while drumming. you know. The voice, though, is a carrier of your personal frequency. So when you're speaking truthfully and with intentionality, you allow yourself to align with your authentic self. Voicing is crucial, man. I used to get in trouble a lot for mumbling. Not in trouble, but pop. Let me just say what it was. Um, and now, as I became a man, I started to see why that was so important that I didn't do that. But I mumbled a lot as a child because of my own insecurities and my own shyness, you know. Um, and I had, parents who weren't having it, you know. But that authentic sound activation, they taught me at a young age, was very important. It's something you could do, again, in silence. Take a deep breath, and say your own name out loud, and say your own name slowly with intention. And when you say it, try to feel and register the vibration of the sound in your chest, and once you feel that energy, now speak an affirmation, right? And speak an affirmation, particularly that aligns with your higher self, right? So it could be, if you're short of one, I am whole, right? I am divinely guided on my path. I am free to be me. Now, when you say those affirmations, however many you want to say, whatever you want to say, it doesn't have to be what I just said. I want you to pay attention to your body and pay attention to how your body reacts to what you just said. Do you feel like a resistance in your body, or do you feel an empowerment based on what was said? When you use your own voice with awareness, uh, you start on the path of reclaiming your spiritual identity. You know, your name is not just a label. Your name is a vibration. And when you speak it with power, your name with power, the universe listens. I've always loved my name. Yusef, it's the name I was given, at birth, Yusef. And then later I was given the name Yuya. They're the same name though, just different languages. It's like Joseph. Joseph, Jose, Yusef, Yosef, Yuya. It's the same name. I love them because I recognize that the universe listens when I say it with confidence. I grew up around young people who didn't have names like how I had. They had, I don't say regular names, David, Michael, Jimmy, but I would say Yusef with, yeah, that's right. I still do, so say your name in that way. And if you don't have a name that you can say that way, reach out to me. We'll work on that. There's a blueprint of authenticity that exists within the cosmos and the universe. Many of us call that sacred geometry. This is technique number 2. And sacred geometry really is the language of the universe. It's the patterns that we find in nature, and sometimes you'll find it in the spirals of a seashell, which you'll notice will mirror the structure of DNA, and that'll let you see that there's a reflection of the divine intelligence that governs existence. That's why sometimes we can get so fascinated and enamored, just and obsessed with finding the perfect shell. We go to the beach and we just walk and walk and walk. We're like, man, where the heck am I? I don't walk, a mile away from my blanket looking for a shell, or walk way out, past the shoreline. But one of the most powerful geometric patterns that you can use, very easy to find, is the flower of life. And that's a symbol that you'll find in ancient Kemet. You find that symbol in China. You find that symbol in what's today known as Israel or Israel. And you find it across sacred different temple sites and spiritual sites worldwide, and It represents the interconnectedness of all things and the perfection of the harmony of creation. So if you're a person who's struggling with authenticity, if you're a person who's struggling with integrity and being your genuine self, it may be because you have been conditioned to believe you are separated from your divine design. You see, sacred geometry. It sort of reminds all of us that we are already encoded with everything that we need. You see, when you start to see certain sacred and divine patterns repeating throughout nature, and you're like, man, that's the way the stars are. That's the way energy is. That's the way DNA is. That's the design I have on my hand. That's the curl in my hair. And you start to realize, well, if this is the patterns that govern the universe and the cosmos and the galaxy and the star systems, and they are held in perfect suspension and order without an issue, they have what they need. And I have that same design within me, then I must, by mere deduction, also have everything I need. So something that I would suggest, activity again, is a meditation with the flower of life. Find an image of it. You can find one online. I would highly suggest you draw it yourself. But if you want to just print one out or have someone who can draw draw it for you, but I suggest you draw it. And real simple. You sit in front of it, you breathe deeply, and you allow your gaze to soften and you stare into it, you know. And as you stare into it, repeat, I am part of the divine pattern. I am exactly where I'm meant to be, and visualize the pattern coming over your entire body, pause, overlaying, your entire body and reinforcing the truth that your soul is structured by by Yahuwah, the Almighty. Your soul has been structured in perfect harmony. It's no accidental creation. So as you see that pattern, overlaying you, reinforce that, even if you want to say it out loud, you know, that my soul is structured in perfect harmony with Yahuwah. So the more you attune yourself to divine patterns, the more you will naturally align with your own truth. You see, it starts to become sort of a lifestyle, if you will. Like I said, I don't want it to be a thing where you have to take a deep breath every time, like, all right, time to go meditate, time to go, but just make it a part of your everyday. Another thing that you could tap into, number 3, maybe I should have named this like the 3 ways to, right? Those are always the suggestion when you do videos, to always put like a number, the 7 ways or whatever. Anyway, um, I'll get it together eventually. Ancestral activation, unlocking your spiritual DNA is important. Like I shared what uh, Baba Acid Hilliard had shared before, with, that statement is that you can't heal until you reclaim the vibration of your ancestors. For some of us, we live our life by that. We understand that our ancestors are not just figures of the past. Our ancestors are living with us. They are the energies within our DNA. They are the whispers that we hear at night when we're falling asleep, or, sometimes they appear to us in dreams. We have different dreams about different people who maybe we did know when they were on the earth, or we don't even know. And they tell us, like, you're this, Um, but they send signs also through synchronicities, that occur. And they hold the wisdom that oftentimes we may need to walk in our authentic power, because sometimes the blessing that they pass down to us, it's the calabash, that holds the power. It's like, yeah, we've always had this here. You got it. It's like Donny Hathaway giving that voice to Layla Hathaway. Like, here's the calabash, right? So, and many, from my experience, what I found in many indigenous systems, um, in particular spiritual systems, there's ancestral reverence, but I don't want you to confuse that for ancestral worship. We don't do that. Idolize no man or woman. And I know my people love to idolize. We have a fetish for idolizing fetishes. That's why everyone's so, head over heels about the Super Bowl halftime show. You saw what K Dot did? You saw what K Dot did? The dude who wore a crown of thorns, blood coming on, that guy. We love our idols. It's not about worshiping, it's about aligning. So when you acknowledge your ancestors, you reclaim the strength, and knowledge embedded inside of your lineage. Why let it go to waste? But it's not idolization. I want to be very clear on that, because we, again, have this obsession with idols, man. We love them. We make them, So I would say, as another practice, what you could do, calling on your ancestors in stillness, right? Everything is going to start with stillness. You find a quiet place and you light a candle. Close your eyes and take some deep breaths. It's going to sound familiar for those of you who have done ANU spiritual training, and you say, ancestors of my bloodline, those who I've known and those who I've not known, I honor you. Guide me to my highest truth. Reveal to me what I've forgotten. You sit in stillness and pay attention to the images that come to you. Now, this is not necromancy. You're not raising the dead. You're not communicating with a dead body or anything like that. We all have inheritances. Sometimes we inherit blessings. Sometimes we inherit curses. But you want to pay attention to, when you make a statement like that, what are the sensations that arise in your body? What are the emotions that arise? And again, what are the images, that come forth? If you feel disconnected from your ancestors, and I know many of you do, it's difficult, especially those who are connected to the story of the Ma'afa. Whether you understand the historical accuracy of it or not, there's definitely been a dispersal of the family unit. Um, Remember, if you're in that place, that ancestors, they live within you. You are their continuation. So the wisdom that you seek is already encoded inside of your being, right? You're not, it's like a deeper conversation with yourself, so again, you're not going external. You don't need to, because you're encoded with that design, uh, that design, that is divine, right? So in aligning energy, this is another thing. Make it a regular practice. What is this, number 4? I think 4. This is number 4. Yeah. So your energy field, right? You've heard me speak about your aura before, and your energy field, your aura, is perpetually and constantly absorbing waves and information from the world around you. And if you've spent years suppressing your nature, then, or your true nature rather, your aura may carry blockages, and those blockages are more dense energy that prevents you from living freely. Imagine, like, having a boulder in front of your door. Every day you go out to walk, you got to try to get around it, squeeze around it. You stub your toe sometimes, you got to hop over it, climb over it. So some of us, we have those sort of dense energy, condensed energy or boulders, within our auric field. And one of the ways that you have that sort of density is they manifest as uh, feeling stuck, a feeling of feeling stuck in life. Uh, Self-sabotage is another way. Being afraid to be judged, fear of judgment, um, unexplained sadness, unexplained anxiety. These are all different signs that you have aura blockages. And willfully, you want to do something about it. You want to fix it. And I could tell you one of the most effective ways to sort of clear those sort of blockages through energetic purification practices um, is to begin with things like, and many of this is in Old Testament or Hebrew Testament. Torah is just that a lot of us didn't know what we were reading, or they became perverted, and we turned them into something that they're not. But yeah, doing energetic purification practices, like if you're one again who studies Kabbalah, you'll notice that water is always sort of mentioned as a conduit for divine energy. And of course, I can say in West African traditions and many of the traditions that I've been initiated in the past, like Isheshe, or what some of you may incorrectly refer to as Ifa. We use libations, and in many of our healing rituals, especially in the Akan region. If you're dealing with the Abosom and the those sort of energies, there's a lot of water. In Nigeria, there's a lot of fire, and Ghana, there's a lot of water. You'll find more libations, but either way, water, right, are used in many healing rituals. And in our just Israelite form, we have um, different baths, spiritual baths that we may take that are prepared a certain way. We may use basil and rosemary and sea salt, and we put our intention, into the process. As we pour that water over ourselves, or we're baptized, and sometimes it's anointing oil, right? And we're looking to cleanse out energies that are not ours. Whatever's here that doesn't belong to me, I want it gone. And we may affirm, I cleanse out all energies that are not mine. I return to my natural state of being. You see, that's one way that we may use energetic purification. I would say wherever we're at, number 4, and I think we're at number 4. If that's 4A, let's go to 4B. 4B would be pranic alignment or pranayama. You've heard me speak about, I think I even did a segment on pranayama before, breath work. Breathing is so important. It's our life force. It's our ruach. It's our prana. It's our chi. It's our emi. So many different systems. You have this concept of breath. The Yoruba is emi, and the Vedics is prana. And Buddhism is chi. And Torah is ruach. But again, get to a quiet space. You seeing a pattern here? And what you want to do is you want to inhale for 4 counts. Hold it for 4. Exhale for 4. And as we're doing that, as we're breathing, we're visualizing there's a amber, or rather a golden light that's coming into the body. And that light that's coming in is dissolving all of the false things that may be within us, all of the extra mask and the energy balls, and everything that's condensed and needs to go. Always remember that breath is your portal. It's a portal, and you can use it to return to your authentic vibration. Breath itself is a gateway. So utilize it. One of the exercises in ANU Spiritual Training, part 1, is the mirror exercise. So many people have difficulty. It's right there in the beginning. They have difficulty with that exercise because folks oftentimes have trouble seeing themselves clearly. Uh, Most people only see their reflected self, and that's the image that others project onto them. So a lot of times when I ask questions, when I'm doing counseling sessions with people and consultations, I'll ask something like, "Hey, so what is your spiritual system?" Nine times out of 10, everybody gets the same answer. I was raised. My grandmother used to take us to, you know, um, but in true metacognition and metaphysical sort of experiences, mirrors are used to access the true self. So it's like you got to look at yourself, not just what people have projected onto. Well, I was always told I was good at this. I was always told I should do this. I was always told I wasn't good at this. I was always told I look like this. I was always told, false reflections. And this is why there are so many cultures around the world that have rituals that involve mirrors, because they not only reveal the physical to some degree, but they reveal the energetic essence of a person. Sometimes the eyes of another person are your mirror, you know, um, what you see in the eyes of other people, you know. So, very similar to the exercise that I provided in ANU Spiritual Training 1 on the Sadulu House website before people ask, we're going to find that cheap. Um, find a mirror and dim your lights down. Light a candle. This is a little different. It's simpler. Um, and what I want you to do is look at your own eyes. Look into your own eyes. And I don't want you to look into your own eyes as a critic. I want you to look into your own eyes as a seeker. Okay. And as you're looking into your own eyes in this mirror, light is dim, say or ask this question: who am I beyond what the world has told me? What truth lies beneath my conditioning? Yeah. And just continue to gaze until you feel a shift. And that shift will be a moment where you see yourself differently. And I have to say, the longer you do this sort of exercise or activity, the deeper you'll connect with your authentic essence. And I know many of you don't want to do it. You won't do it because it's like you don't want to sit in silence. You don't want to face yourself, you know. But alignment has a reward, that unfortunately so many people go their whole lives with never experiencing because they don't want to live authentically and with integrity and with genuineness. It's everything is based on a scheme and an angle and a manipulation. But living authentically is not just about feeling better. It's about realigning with the divine order. That's what living authentically is about. When Musa doubted himself, the divine did exactly, or the divine didn't give him an external sign of power. You know, like it was no meteor that crossed the sky or something. The divine instead just gave a message. Eye Asher, I am what I am creating myself to be. That's all you need to know. I am what I'm creating myself to be. People always got a whole lot of this, you know. Um, and that's all you really need to put out there, man. That's your ultimate truth. I am the work that the word is creating and unfurling inside of me to be. I don't need to seek outside for validation. Don't need it. You know, I don't need permission, right? I don't need anyone's permission to become. I don't need anyone's permission to create myself into what I'm creating myself to be. Only thing I need to do is to return to my natural state of being. That's what I need to do, because that's where my power and my value, my authenticity lies. So, I would 100% encourage you to use the tools, that I've given. What was it? 4 or 5? Somebody count. Maybe somebody be nice and list them in the comments. I know I should, but a brother busy. A brother's progressive. Excuse me. They didn't want to say busy. Incorrect term. It's a very progressive season for me right now. Um, yeah, maybe I'll get around to it, but I probably won't. So yeah, but whether it was four, and I think I gave it A and B underneath yours, so maybe a 4 and a 5, somewhere around there. But use them, and remember that the universe will adjust accordingly to your action. That's sort of the very interesting thing about the universe. You know, when you start to walk your own path as a reward, the world will resist you. When you begin, it will resist you. Your family will resist you, or your relatives, rather. I like to use that term. For those that are in the way of your progression, those are relatives. That's not your family. But your relatives, society, um, even your own mind will try to pull you back into what is comfortable for you, pull you back into conformity. But the moment you step fully into your own path, everything changes. Everything changes the moment you step into your own path with that courage and with that boldness and with that authenticity. You think about, again, the story of Musa, the story of Moshe. The moment that he accepted his role, his calling, but I'm going to call it his role, the seas parted. When he accepted his role and handed out or stretched out his staff with authority, that represented his authority, right? The Red Sea said, phew. So there's a universal truth there that when we align with our higher selves, obstacles begin to dissolve. Of course, there's a resistance at first, of course, because we're reshaping the world. If I were to knock down a building and then use the rubble to build something else, the building was designed in a way where it was not meant to be knocked down. So it's going to resist my bulldozer, my hammer at first. Then eventually it will break and then I can rebuild. It was also Dr. Asa Hilliard that, made an important point when he said that you were never meant to be a copy. He said that you're the only one who can walk your path. That's like another calling or reminder that you don't need to seek permission to be yourself. You don't. You know, uh, you were created by the supreme intelligence, just as you are, and for a reason. You got to trust that. You got to walk boldly in that, and you have to live your kind of way. Your kind of way. You know. Um, yeah, there's so much to that. I'm pulling myself back from saying even more. So I would just say for you all, take a deep breath. As you're hearing these things, especially those of you who are hearing them and you're feeling some anxiety, like, oh, I know I'm supposed to be, but I'm not. I know how it gets, man. Some of us have been, really fighting that mask for so long that the mask starts to feel comfortable. You're like, well, Mask is all right. No one needs to see my real face. You know, I got acne now and blackheads, so I don't want to show it anyway from wearing a mask for so long. But you take a deep breath and place your hand over your heart and just feel your presence. Feel your own presence. Recognize you're not lost. You're not lost. You're not broken. Um, you are moving into a space of where you need to be. You can always affirm with yourself, I am, and that's enough. Start there. If you have trouble getting into the still place and the quiet places, you're afraid of the dark and afraid of quiet, start there. I am. That's enough. Now, if you need the corroboration, you can look at all the things I said about sacred geometry and Ruach and John 1:1, but you need quick and dirty, right? Go forth and just live unapologetically. You know, the world does need you. Need you. But not as they want you to be. The world needs you as you truly are. Sometimes they just don't know it. You gotta let them, you gotta let them know. This is, I've said that so many times in my teachings where people have said, oh man, I like when you teach about this. I like when you teach, or Chief, can you talk about this? Chief, can you talk about? No, I'm gonna talk about what I talk about, and I'm gonna teach you what you're supposed to be asking me for, because you don't know. You don't know what you're actually supposed to want. Some of you. So I have to teach you. This is what you're supposed to, or like I did a segment years ago called Master Student. I'm gonna teach you how to be a student because you don't know how to be a good student. You probably were never a good student, but this YouTube thing happened. And you can get online and you can get access to things that you used to have to pay a lot of money for that you didn't have, or you didn't have the academic credentials to even make it to that level. I know you. As speakers and presenters, we train ourselves, some of us, to be very kind. And I've seen a lot of times where the limits of people's patience was like completely tested, sometimes by the audience. Sometimes you might have a rude audience or highly uninformed audience, and you got to keep it classy. You don't say, "Oh, that was a dumb question." Well, you can't do stuff like that, or you might say something and somebody come back with something completely different than what you just said. Like, oh, you kind of slow. You have to be more kind and more loving and more charitable than that if you're truly going to do this work. And one of the things you have to do sometimes is you have to teach multiple things while you're teaching. Not only are you teaching the information, but you also might be teaching a person how to process the information, how to study, how to take their notes. You're doing all of these things at once, especially when you're dealing with the Kibalining people who are who've been victimized by the Ma'afa, victimized by systemic, racism and systematic oppression. You have to know who you're speaking to. And, just understand that a lot of our people have underdeveloped brains. They were raised on very poor food. They were raised on very poor education. No one spoke about brain development in their conception. No one spoke about brain development in their prenatal care, you know. Um, and then the education was horrible. The culture is horrible. They were raised on stupid videos and stupid social media and wicked holidays like Valentine's Day. They were raised on the worst of all things. You know, and we have to know that about our people when we're speaking to them. I met a beautiful brother yesterday. I got a message from him actually. I was walking down the street and I seen him. I'm always scanning when I'm walking. I got that hunter's thing. I'm always scanning. So I saw him ways off. So I get closer to him. And usually when I get close to people like that who are just standing, like I had earbuds in, but it wasn't any sound playing. Most of the time I don't have anything playing. I just put them in so I can, if I want to pretend like I got something playing, in case I run into somebody I don't want to run into, you know. So I heard him say, um, he looked over me. He was like, "Brother, are you into? Or do you believe or something? Valentine's Day? Do you have a Valentine?" He had a big teddy bear, like one of them big ones, and some flowers. And I'm like, man, I hope this ain't that other thing, you know. And I was like, what? You know, I probably said it more kind than that. But he was like, yeah, and I was like, nah, man, that's wicked. I don't do Valentine's Day. It's for wicked people. I just was like, yeah, just you need to hear it straight. And he was like, I know, man. I was actually studying something like that. He said, but I came to bring these things to this girl I know. We're just friends. But I called her and she's like out of town, you know. And he was like, you know, I guess I'm getting to the age now where I got to realize that you can't just pop up on people. I was like, yeah, you know, it happens, you know. But I said, hey, it gives you a great opportunity. He was like, so I just wanted to like give it to somebody or whatever. And I was like, well, nah, I have no use for it, brother. But I said, tell you what you could do. You know, the first woman elder you see walking by, get the flowers to her. And then the teddy bear, go to a daycare and ask if you can, you know, donate the teddy bear to the daycare. He's like, yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. Now, meanwhile, while we talk, we were out. It was cold too. We out there in the cold, and I'm now witnessing to him. You know, we're going through. I brought him through the history of Valentine's Day and what it really meant. I spoke to him about Eros. We spoke about Thanksgiving. We spoke about Christmas. Like we're going in. He was like, man, this is so good. He said, I've been wanting to learn things like that, man. And he started sharing about his life and his testimony and the things he's gone through. We'll say that, and going through. And you know, we're just going in, man. And as I'm speaking to him, I'm adjusting my speech. Now, something funny happened while we were there speaking. The young lady um, called him and was like, I'm back," because we were there for a while. So I'm like, she wasn't out of town. But I didn't say that to her. You know, I'm like, she must have had a dude at her spot or just didn't want to be bothered with him or whatever. So he told her like where he was. Like, yeah, I've been here talking the whole time. Like, if you want to come by, you know. So she walked up. You know, I don't know where she came from, and he gave the bear and the flowers to her, whatever. So they were like chit chatting a little bit. She gave him a hug, and I was like, you know what? Because we exchanged numbers already. I was like, I'll give you a call, brother. I was like, you know, do your thing. Because obviously he liked her. He was like, yeah, she's just a friend. I'm like, whatever. You know, a nice looking young lady. She was, you know, pretty girl. But yeah, I could tell by that hug. A lot of things you could tell with a hug. But anyway, that was just an example of, you know, sometimes having to adjust. You know, he shared the thing, you know, about Valentine's, and I didn't attack him. You know, like, what, brother? You should know. But, you know, I was like, nah, man, I'm not really, you know, that's wicked. I don't, you know, but I knew that I could at least say that to him. You know, I knew that I was safe enough to say that to him. You know, and lo and behold, we started a whole new communication. He was like, yeah, you know, I don't go to church. I used to, but he was like, I saw an angel. You know, I saw an angel some years back, man, and it was like 9 feet above me. So he was like, ever since then, I just look for angels. He said, that's like my new church. That's like my new religion. Okay, cool. So we talking about the angel thing, you know. Um, so you never know when you're called upon to represent your authentic self, but always do it with kindness. You know, he might be a new ANU member, or he might just be a new cat coming into the truth. I don't know. I need to text him though. I need to follow up. I'll wait till after Sabbath and just hit him up, see how he's doing. Um, but that's what it is. When you're always moving and walking in that, you'll have those opportunities to leave an imprint and an impression upon the world. But you always want to do it with charity. Charity is love. Do it with love, you know. Um, don't criticize people unnecessarily. Sometimes people need to be critiqued. Yeah. They need that sometimes. If you judge righteously. Like when I said the thing I said about Valentine's, I then broke it down. I was like, yeah, let me tell you about Valentine's. And he said, he was like, wow, wow. He's like, man. So then he was like, I'm gonna throw this stuff out. I was like, no, don't throw it out. Don't do that. Like, you spent money for it, you know. I was like, and that's when I was like, yo, just donate it. Like, break up the pairing though. Break up the flowers from the teddy bear, you know. But I said, there's little children who would love to play with that big old teddy bear. Like, that's, you know, it was one of those big tall ones, like probably like maybe 3 feet tall. You know, it was a big teddy bear. I was like, nah, man, take that to a daycare, and you know. And I said, you know, you see an elder walking down the street, just give her the flowers, just cause, you know, put some good karma into the atmosphere, you know. So yeah, I would just say that, you know, as you're going through these practices and you're working to reclaim your authentic voice again, don't neglect the power of charity in it all, the power of kindness in it all, the power of love in it all. It's all, it goes along with it, and you have to turn those forces inward. Like when you look in the mirror and you look to say, like, okay, what's going on in there? Be kind to yourself. Be gentle. Because of some of those masks, they've been on for so long that you rip them off, man, you're gonna rip some skin off at the same time. You know, so some of them you have to peel it slowly. You know, you got to put some shea butter in there first, you know, or some peanut oil, so you loosen it up around there. You know, put some black soap, and then slowly, you know, take that mask off. And you know the timing of your soul, or if you don't, you will. You'll learn it. You know, you don't have to do things when people say you're supposed to do them. Oh man, I'm 30. Like he said, he was turning 30. The 15th of March. Yeah, March 15th. And he was like, man, I'm getting ready to be 30. And he was like, you know I shouldn't just be popping at people's house. I was like, look, man, because he's brother from Jamaica. I was like, no, man, that's just culture. I said, the culture is just different here. That's all. But I said, yeah, just going to somebody's house now, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. I just told him, like, yeah, in this culture here, people are not as friendly. So, you know, they're not as maybe as welcoming to guests, you know. But I think something else is going on. Just my big brother intuition. You know, my big brother intuition, or maybe my fatherly intuition. I mean, young enough to be my son, or fatherly intuition. Like, something else was happening, you know. But yeah, man, I just wanted to share um, that teaching on authenticity, and willfully you apply all those different tools, and let me know how it goes, please. I'm always reading, and read the comments. I check in and see how you're applying these things and how you're moving forward. All right. So with that, thank you. And as always, if you want a deeper connection, I urge you can apply for ANU Life Global Ministries, or ANU Nation really, but you go to anulifeglobal.org. The link is always in the videos. I always put a big old link thing, graphic in the video, but you can go there and you can apply or download your copy of the ANU Way and kind of crack open your brain a little bit, start learning some things that may be a little outside of your comfort zone, and try them out. Try out some of the things that are in the ANU Way, and see if your experience changes as a result of taking on a different culture that may speak more to your authentic being. All right. So thank you so much again. And as always, thank you for your support. And thank you for they're not super chats, Sister Caroline. Um, whatever they're called, donations, offerings. I don't know what they call them here. I know the super chats is when you're doing a live. But thank you for those who have donated, who have sent, offerings to the ministry. They go to a good place, just so you know. And those things we've been sharing and going to be sharing more. We got another harvest, actually. Yeah, I'll talk about that later. But our pineapples are moving a little slow, and our watermelon actually got too much sun this year. So the harvest wasn't. We did two, but it wasn't. The second harvest wasn't exactly. It was okay, but it wasn't really where it needed to be. But we did well with the charcoal. Some of y'all don't know what I'm talking about. Some of you ANU members do. You've seen the videos of the land and the food and stuff we grow. But yeah, man. So give thanks for that, for your presence. Give thanks for coming through. And willfully, this has been something that has sparked some thought and sparked some progression towards your more authentic self and returning to your divine essence. As always, I am Chief Yuya, and I want to thank you for sharing some time with me. All right. Shabbat Shalom.